Welcome students to week 4, where we are going to look at the third main category. So we've looked at blood and sweat. This week we're going to look at tears. And this first video is going to be a video that is more general, and then I'm going to do another video specifically on the crisis at the US-Mexico border and the situation of the Central American asylum seekers. But first, let's look at the whole world. So according to the most recent report that you're reading, actually the 2020 report from the UNHCR, there are 82.4 million displaced people in our world right now. And I think we can only take that in appropriately if we really remember that each of those are someone for whom Jesus died. So we can only, it's hard to do this, right? Because those numbers are mind-boggling, but it's essential as Christians. Every one of those displaced human beings is precious to God, and therefore precious to those of us who are his disciples. So how do we define a displaced person? The UNHCR uses a definition which is broader than the international legal definition for asylum seekers and refugees. That they say that these people are displaced because of persecution, conflict, violence, human rights violations, or serious disturbances of public order. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not also interested potentially in improving their lives by moving to another country, but that is not their primary reason. Their primary reason is not what they're going towards, but what they're running away from. Now, this broader definition is also used in some regional agreements, like the agreement in Cartagena and the Organization of African States. So it's not just used in this particular report, it's used more widely. And there is an even broader definition that I happen to like that Betts and Collier come up with. That Betts and Collier refer to the category of people that we need to be concerned about around forced migration as people who need protection from serious physical harm in the absence of a reasonable choice to protect themselves in their own home. So if you put yourself in someone's place and you would leave, that's how you understand people who are in that category. Of course, the legal international definition is narrower, that a refugee is someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion, who is currently outside of their country of origin. So displaced people within their country of origin are in a different category for that legal definition than people who are outside their country of origin. That definition was coined in the 1951 convention. That was the first worldwide, or not worldwide, but most of the world, first global agreement on the responsibility to receive refugees, to welcome refugees. So there are 26.4 million people who are refugees or asylum seekers. So these are people whose claims to asylum have received or are in process towards either individual or group recognition. So you can be recognized as a refugee because you come from a persecuted group, or you can be recognized as a refugee because you have proven that individually you are in danger. And of course, that higher standard that you are individually in danger is very hard to prove for anyone who's running for their lives, because you don't always have time to find documents. So this whole question of how you vet a refugee, which is highly politically controversial, is also very humanly poignant. Now, 86% of these folks, this 26.4 million, are hosted in developing countries, not in the wealthiest countries of the world. 27% of them are hosted in the least developed countries. And 73% of them are in adjacent countries to the country where the crisis is. So that is very clear proof that these people are not running towards, they're running from. They're just running the absolute minimal distance that they have to go in order to be safe. And this is a real tragedy, that 76% of them are in a protracted situation. That's defined as 25,000 people from the same nationality in the same host country for over 5 years. And the actual average time that people have stayed in refugee camps right now is over a decade. So this protected situation is very common. I actually want to add one important piece of information, that the conditions that cause large amounts of people to leave are not just violence and poverty in themselves. Certainly, violence and poverty make people want to leave, but people typically don't leave unless they are facing either a hostile or fragile state. So they're facing a state in which order has fallen apart because the government either does not have the legitimacy or does not have the capacity to exert sufficient force to keep people safe. So most of these people are coming from fragile states, and of course there are many fragile states where governments don't have this legitimacy or this power, where people also don't leave in huge numbers. There have to be fragile states, and then there needs to be some kind of trigger, and that's what causes large numbers of people to leave. So let me give you a little bit of history, just a really simple history, like the key historical events that you need to know. We have records of people who would fit into the definition of a refugee going all the way back to ancient Greece and Rome. But the first clearly documented records we have come shortly after the Treaty of Westphalia, which was in 1648, the treaty in Europe that created the modern nation state. And we have records of Huguenot French Protestants taking shelter in Britain. So those were the first sort of semi-official refugees that we have records for. In 1921, the League of Nations, which was the predecessor to the United Nations, created a high commission which granted travel documents to stateless people. They were called the Nantes documents. Then in 1951, we have the Convention of the Status of Refugees, now signed by 145 countries, although ironically not by some of the countries who are some of the major providers of refuge, which is very interesting, and we could talk a long time about that. Like, why is that true? It also created the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Then in 1967, the protocol relating to the status of refugees officially extended what had been created to the whole world and not just to Europe. It was really created thinking about Europe, thinking about a combination of the Holocaust and the Iron Curtain. But it was then extended in 1967, although Betts and Collier would say it was extended without sufficient reflection on how the global situation was different than the situation in Europe at the end of World War II. Now, the United States was actually a leader in inspiring and supporting the Convention for the Status of Refugees. But the United States has a long history of real ambivalence towards refugees. During World War II, roughly 2/3 of the population did not want to receive any Jewish refugees, even children. And we have a famous story, which was made into a movie called The Voyage of the Damned, of a large ship of Jewish refugees who were able to escape the Holocaust and then were turned away at the border of the United States. So the United States is not sort of consistently pro-refugee, but we as a country were very concerned about people fleeing communist countries after the Iron Curtain came down. We wanted to make very sure that those people were welcomed by the West and not returned. And that was a major impetus behind our push for the Convention of the Status of Refugees. We had our first national legislation covering asylum seekers and refugees in 1962, which promised financial support to this larger international collaboration and pledged that we would not commit refoulement, that we would not send people back to countries where they would be in danger. And then the Refugee Act of 1980 built on that, partly in response to the refugees who came from Vietnam. We set an annual limit of 50,000 with room for emergencies and a process for emergencies. And actually, from 1980 until 2017, we welcomed between 50,000 and 125,000 a year. Under the Trump administration, that number went way down to around 17,000, which is what it was before the Refugee Act of 1980. So these are just some last thing is that in 1980, we established the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which works in public-private partnerships. So World Relief, LIRS, which is the Lutheran Immigration Relief Services, Catholic Charities, all of those agencies began their role in collaborating with our government to resettle refugees when the ORR was created. So these are just a few important historical developments that you need to know. What are the objectives? What are we trying to accomplish when we welcome refugees? So first and foremost, what we're offering is protection, which is defined as the right to non-refoulement, humanitarian assistance, and basic civil rights. But we are also committed to long-term solutions. And there are 3 solutions that people talk about. You can repatriate people. You can send them back to their country if it's safe for them to go back, if the conditions have changed on the ground. You can relocate them to another country, or you can integrate them into the country that they're staying in. Now, Betts and Collier take those big goals and they create some specific objectives underneath them, that they say that we should also specifically aspire to sustainability at scale, which means not just what they call the boutique refugees that make it to the highly developed world, but every refugee should be equally the object of our concern, the subject of our concern. Then we also want protection for the duration of risk. It's not sufficient to have protection initially. You have to have protection for the duration of risk. And then the point of their whole book is really autonomy and development, that refugees need to be able to take care of themselves for their own sake, for the sake of the country that they're in, and for any possibility of return. So the question is, how do we make that happen? Then we really want to, of course, to have a route out of limbo, and that requires the management of onward movement. Betts and Collier also talk about the central importance of what they call reasonable legislation. That we are pretty fond internationally the world is pretty fond of aspirational legislation. That we set goals, whether it's the Sustainable Development Goals or whatever we're doing, that, or the goals around climate change and environmental protection. We set goals that no one obeys. We create laws, that no one obeys, because there's really no means of enforcement. So the question is, that Betts and Collier say that if the legislation is more reasonable, it will be more likely to be obeyed. And that part of what that would mean in the area of asylum seekers and refugees would be clear arrangements for shared burden and fairly shared burden and comparative advantage. So they're suggesting that every country does some amount of welcoming and some amount of funding contributing to the international need, but really relative to capacity. So certain countries are much better sites for people to stay for a long period of time, but they don't have the money. Other countries have the money, but are not as good sites for people to stay for a long period of time if part of your goal is repatriation. Because if someone, for example, comes to Germany and they integrate into the society there, that society is sufficiently different that it's going to make it less easy afterwards to go back to Syria. Whereas if you're integrating into Turkey, there are similar enough societies that it's quite easy to go back. So Betts and Collier's point is that we should increase the capacity of these less developed adjacent countries to do a good job of hosting refugees by pouring money from outside. So there's a lot of questions around that particular proposition, but it's important to pay attention to. It's logical. So Betts and Collier also talk about the importance of regional agreements. It's quite hard to come up with international agreements that have teeth in them, but you can do a much better job coming up with regional agreements, and also the engagement of business and civil society. So they propose, for example, development zones where international businesses come and utilize refugee labor and compensate refugees accordingly. And so again, it's an interesting proposal worth discussing, right? They're also saying that the UNHCR needs to move away from direct humanitarian assistance wherever possible and instead offer political facilitation. So broker these negotiations between countries for who contributes what and expert authority. So they also propose core ethical principles. Now, this is interesting because these are non-religious. These are secular ethical principles. So we need to look at them through a biblical lens and see what we think of them. But I think it's really a fascinating process to say what kind of ethical agreements could the world buy into. So they suggest 3 of them. That the main one is the duty of rescue. And I absolutely love this quote. This is from page 100 of their book. It says, "It is not saintly to experience such a sense of compassion. It is sociopathic not to experience it." So they're saying that human beings are so constructed. It's a philosophical and ethical statement that we have a basic organic response to somebody who is suffering persecution. And we owe them the duty of rescue. But then going beyond that, they say, we don't have unlimited capacity for rescue. And so we need to prioritize need, like who actually has the greatest need. And we need to pay attention to the principle of partnership, that you don't rescue by yourself as an individual or a country or a church, but you figure out how we can work in partnership to rescue. So this is big picture framing, and I hope it's helpful for you this week. Now I'm going to do the second video for you on the border and Central American asylum seekers.